I'll look right now. I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, pretty good, that is.
It's been how many years? I'm just not good at setting up that other camera that you've got. Heard.
Let me plug in for mine to see if
Okay. Yeah, because the sound is on.
Arriving today.
and keep in mind it's recording too.
Okay.
It says, Carlos, it says now arriving per day, but it doesn't say.
The buyer.
Look at the name of the buyer. Is it WATTERS or WATERS? Two T's?
You're not sharing the screen on the on Zoom.
I'm not, huh? I thought it was.
Yeah, 2 T's. We were talking about facing again.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, it's showing up here.
Because you're plugged into the projector.
Oh, no wonder. Okay.
Needing my right off bridge.
Yeah, it's probably good. Yeah, hopefully people have a laptop, but
So help you with that.
yes, because I would say I'm struggling.
So it's up here.
Yeah, no wonder.
Now we're gonna do share.
We got a lot of people online. Thank you.
And yeah, it shows you that that's what.
Okay, great. I'm not able to get rid of this border at the top, which I don't want.
You should be able to hide it.
Yeah, I would think so. Okay, that's better.
Yeah, this is
That's good. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna just turn these lights down.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning. Jonathan, I see you're back.
Might have your speak.
He's just not engaged. Because can everyone remotely hear me?
I can hear you.
Can everybody that's remote hear me?
Sorry, yes, I am here. Hello.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
We can hear.
Yes, I can hear well.
Wonderful. Okay. So let's go through the purchase contract. When you open up the purchase contract, remember, if you're writing a purchase contract, I'm not going to go through this at this moment in time. When you're assuming the property is listed, you can use MLS Connect to download all the information into the purchase contract, so you don't have to type in the APN number, the license information for the agent, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of information that the listing agent is already doing for you when you're going to be drafting a purchase contract. So the very first form that you're going to see when opening up the California Residential Purchase Agreement is going to be the disclosure regarding a real estate agency relationship. This is required statutorily. When I say statutorily, it just means the law requires that we have this document signed. Now, in the very first box, if checked, This would be associated with the lease. If the lease term is for in excess of 1 year, then you're required to have a disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. Regardless, we internally always require that. So it tells the tenant, the client, whoever it may be, just the relationship between us and them. So there's, in this part, oh, Jesse Waters is one of our clients, as a matter of fact. Yeah, so we're representing him in regards to a purchase contract. But to find out if he actually qualifies, my guess is he's probably earning sufficient money. So I checked the box for buyer, and Jesse happens to be our buyer, as a matter of fact. And then I am the agent representing Jesse. Now, the second page of the disclosure regarding agency relationship is just an example. So on page 2, if you send this out electronically, there's nothing that's going to be signed. In this block, it's just showing once again, just what we're going to see on page 1 of the purchase contract. I'm not sure why it's not let me highlight that, but that's okay. So you can see seller's brokerage firm, do not complete sample only. And that's exactly what you should expect. There's nothing for you to complete there, nothing for your client to complete either. And then now we go directly to the California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow Instructions. The date prepared, top left corner, is very important because anytime we reference an addendum or an amendment to the purchase contract, we're going to be referencing the date prepared, not the date that the contract was executed. So keep that in mind. Anytime you're amending an existing document, you're always going to reference the date prepared, not the date that it was executed. Section 1A, this is an offer from, Jesse happens to be our buyer. 12 Longview is the address. And had I used MLS Connect, it would have populated the assessor's parcel number. So I don't even know what it is, but just that's a good example for you to understand certain things that you don't have to do when using MLS Connect to draft a purchase contract. And then let's go on to section 2B, confirmation of agency relationship. This is required once again by law, so we have to complete this appropriately. If we don't complete it appropriately here, we have to complete Form AC, agency confirmation, but let's just do it right the very first time. So in this case, the seller's brokerage firm is Coldwell Banker Platinum Properties. Carlos Rodriguez is representing the seller. Now you can see, and then you can see the buyer's brokerage firm is also Coldwell Banker Platinum Properties. Richard Moore is representing the buyer. And even though we each have our own client because it's under the same broker's license, it is considered dual agency. You can see then the box is checked, both the buyer and the seller for dual agent. If we happen to be from different offices, say it's Coldwell Banker Realty representing the seller and Coldwell Banker Platinum Properties representing the buyer, we would check the boxes as I've shown here. And once again, to the right, you can see the license numbers are populated. If in the event you're using MLS Connect, it will populate the listing agent's individual license number together with the brokerage under which their license is affiliated.
You even got the correct license number for me in there.
I did. Can you believe that?
Yeah.
I don't know why that's so funny. Let's continue on. Any questions about that? Remember, under the same broker's license, dual agency, if there's agents representing both the buyer and seller from the same office. If it's not, then you each have, it's not dual agency. So that's how simplistic it becomes, as a matter of fact. So under section 3A, purchase price, I'm going to say for simplistic purposes, I'm using $1 million. Is there anything that's selling in Orange County for $1 million for a single family home? Most likely not. If it's an all cash offer, I would check the box to the right that says all cash. I'm going to remove that check mark at this point in time. And you can see if I check that box, if we look at section 3E1 to the right, there's $800,000 for a loan amount. That will eliminate that. So you can have both an all cash offer and an offer with a loan. So in this case, I'm going to remove the all cash offer. And then when you do check the box for all cash offer, by the way, You don't need to say that I'm removing the loan contingency because the body of the contract indicates that there is no loan contingency. Some people sometimes also say, oh, well, there's no loan contingency because it's an all cash offer, but it's not necessary that you do that. The presumption contractually is that there is no loan contingency. Section 3B, close of escrow. I think it's rare that we want to specify a certain close of escrow date, so it's preferred that we specify a number of days after acceptance. And can anyone here define for me acceptance besides Carlos? All right, then I'll tell you. Oh, you're going to raise your hand. Tell us.
Fully executed is when all parties have signed.
And then
The
what?
final person has signed.
So after it's signed, then what? Offer the predetermined time frame is once a buyer submits an offer, 3 calendar days after all buyer signatures, not 3 calendar days after date of delivery, but 3 calendar days after the buyer's signature, it expires. So I may have my buyer signed today, but I may not deliver it until tomorrow. So there's really only 2 days remaining, as a matter of fact. Section D1, initial deposit amount. In this case, we just happen to say we're going to deposit 3%. The 3% is not a it's simply just a mathematical function. So if the purchase price is increased to $2 million, then the deposit or the earnest money deposit will remain at $30,000 unless somebody were to amend that via counteroffer. So the dollar amount is fixed. The percentage is just for calculation purposes only. And then to the right, the initial deposit amount. This is the only time in a purchase contract in which business days is referenced. So after acceptance, the buyer has 3 business days after acceptance to deliver the earnest money deposit. That's a long time. So if you're working with a buyer, if you're the buyer's agent, I think if you want to show your offer to be more aggressive, let's reduce that. If I'm a listing agent, I may want to counter that. Because if it's accepted on Friday, the buyer has until the following Wednesday to make their deposit. It's a long time. It's 5 days after acceptance. So keep that in mind. And then what takes place if a buyer doesn't deliver their deposit? Well, the contract lives on, and the only way a seller can cancel is by first delivering a notice to perform. But when they deliver a notice to perform, the buyer's given 2 more days to perform that obligation. That's a long time. They don't, let's, in my example, acceptance is on Friday. They have 3 days, so they have until Wednesday to deliver the deposit. They don't do that, so on Wednesday, we send a notice to perform. They have until Friday to deliver that money. Or what if I'm not staying on top of my contract and I don't deliver that notice to perform until Thursday? So now they have until Monday of the following week to deliver that deposit. They've tied the property up that entire time. So as a listing agent, you need to be very careful in regards to how you manage that.
But why is that, Rich? If it's 2 days, right? Is it because
2
of the
days, yeah.
weekend
If the
on the notice
expiration,
to perform?
yeah. So if the execution of an event, for example, with the notice to perform or the contract, close of escrow falls in a weekend or legal holiday, it then falls to the following business day. So that's why. So if I give a notice to perform on Thursday, now the execution of the event actually will fall till Monday because the second day after delivering the notice to perform is going to be Saturday. It's going to fall till the following Monday. Hopefully I've made that clear when I'm giving my explanation. D2, increased deposit. It's a rarity. We're going to skip over that. We don't see anything too often like that. And then the loan amount, I'm going to remove this checkbox for all cash. $800,000. So we're saying, once again, the percentage, 80% of the purchase price, it's just a calculation. And the presumption is the financing is going to be conventional. So with this in mind, we're saying we're going to be borrowing $800,000 and pursuing a conventional loan. So in the event I decide that I want to pursue a loan with only 10% down, and really I want to get a loan for $900,000, if I'm not successful obtaining that financing, I cannot cancel based upon the loan contingency. So the buyer has an obligation to pursue the financing that's shown in here, whatever the offer is, if they wish to cancel based upon the loan contingency. Remember, they just can't cancel based upon the loan contingency. They have to be denied the financing. And that means they have to comply with all the lender's requests. And if they don't, the lender's declination letter is going to indicate that maybe the buyer didn't deliver their bank statements, didn't deliver their W-2 or pay stubs, things like that. So you have to be very careful about that. When the buyer sometimes is saying, well, I'm going to change the financing other outside of the scope of what the contract was, then what you should do is obtain some type of an amendment to the contract to specify, now I want to change the financing to putting only 10% down as opposed to 20% down. And that will protect your buyer, as a matter of fact. Doesn't mean the other party is going to agree to it. Any questions about that? And then you can see there's 2 bullet points beneath the $800,000. So the interest rate, not to exceed 7%. If rates today are 6%, we should probably put something higher than 6%, 6.25% or 6.5%. Is if I put 5% in there and rates today are at 6%, the contract's already going to fail. It's a contingency for the buyer, as a matter of fact. So the listing agent should obviously counter that, but let's give some type of flexibility when we're doing this. Then buyer to pay up to, I said 0 points. If you leave that blank, maybe the buyer has to pay 10 points and they can get the financing. So let's not put them in that position. And then to the right, you can see conventional. That is the presumed type of financing. FHA, VA, seller financing other, and FHA and VA has 2 implications associated with that. If you're getting an FHA loan or a VA loan, contractually, you're required to attach an amendatory clause. And the amendatory clause states that the property must appraise at the purchase price, otherwise the buyer can cancel. And even in the event the buyer has an appraisal contingency, they're getting FHA or VA financing, and they release the appraisal contingency, if the appraised value does not come in at the purchase price or higher, they still can cancel. That's how strong the amendatory clause is. And any lender that's providing FHA or VA financing will require that an amendatory clause be signed. So 2 things, contractually, it's required, and then the buyer's lender is going to require that an amendatory clause is signed by the buyer. Any questions about that? And then further down in section E1, you can say if FHA or VA check, deliver, list, lender required repairs. So the lender may require certain repairs to the property that a conventional lender may not require. And if the seller refuses to do that, the contract's going to fail because the lender's not going to provide the financing and the buyer can cancel based upon the loan contingency. Section E2, additional financed amount. We're just going to skip over that. It could be a second deed of trust, for example. I don't see that too often in today's world. And this is very important. Section E3, occupancy type. The default is primary residence. If it's going to be an investment property or secondary residence, we should check the appropriate box. And if you're, that's my word.
People being indicted for this, it's loan fraud.
That's right, it's loan fraud. We're hearing Letitia James, right? You know, the AG in New York, right? She claimed that it was primary residence.
Even after refinancing it.
Even after oh, okay.
So it's not, it wasn't a mistake. It was like
it was intentional, right? Yeah. So yeah, you could be indicted for that, right? Those are good examples, as a matter of fact. Maybe they're not going to come after us. She's kind of a high-profile individual, I would say. But clients will say, well, I can get a lower interest rate if I show it as a primary residence. Don't ever allow them to do that. And you should put in writing that they're acting against your advice. If for some reason it is going to be an investment property and they're pursuing a primary residence loan, it is just not worth it, as a matter of fact. So keep that in mind. And not only that, but if you're representing the buyer, you should be getting a pre-approval letter or pre-qualification letter, and it should be specifying that it's an investment property. And if you're a listing agent, you should be looking at that as if it's not a primary residence, then that pre-qual or pre-approval letter should specify it's for an investment property. So keep that in mind also. Then the balance of the down payment is just a mathematical equation because we said the purchase price is $1 million. We put a $30,000 earnest money deposit down, and the balance of the money we need to come up with is $170,000. So now what if I make an offer in the purchase? In our example, we said we're going to put 20% down, get an $800,000 loan. And now I'm the buyer and I decide to change my approach. And I want to put 30% down. So I'm really financing less, correct? What's the dilemma with that? First of all, the seller's relying on my representation. I'm going to put 20% down. But if I don't have $300,000 to put down, I can't cancel. The amount of the deposit and the money for closing costs is not a contingency of the purchase contract. So that's how it can work against you. Yeah, maybe you'll qualify for the $700,000 loan, but if you don't have $300,000, then you may not be able to actually close the transaction. So you can see why even when deciding I want to put more money down, how that could negatively affect a buyer.
And as a listing agent, you can, if they let you know that's what they're doing, you can request an updated proof of funds.
Yeah, and really what should be happening, we should be amending the contract to specify that. Now, most people, I would say most buyers agents are probably concerned about doing something like that because now it's changing what I consider to be a material aspect of the contract.
Rich, what's an average percentage that a buyer will need for closing costs to add on top of everything else?
Well, that's a good question. I would think at least 1 to 2% of the purchase price. And then in our environment, sometimes we see evidence of funds for monies that aren't patriated in the US. Now it's up to the seller to make that decision to accept the proof of funds if that's acceptable to them. I would not advise a seller to accept that because if for some reason the person can't get the money out of the originating country, then maybe they can't close the transaction. Or at minimum, it's probably going to be delayed. Seller credit to buyer section G1. So under the heading of seller payment to cover buyer expenses and costs. And this is something you and I talked about just the other day, as a matter of fact. So it's possible that I want the seller to give me a closing cost credit, and I'm going to say $10,000. Now, we also, in our example in section 3G3, we want the seller to compensate the buyer's agent. Now, what if I just were to combine that into section 3G1? So we know in section 3G3, I said that me as the buyer, I'm obligated to pay my agent 3%. But I decide just to put it all in here and say it's $40,000. Well, out of that, I can pay my agent $30,000 and I have $10,000 for closing costs. However, lenders will only permit so much to be applied or a maximum amount of a credit. However, in regards to the maximum credit when evaluating a file, the lender is not going to include the commissions that are being paid to the agent. So there's a difference. $10,000, most likely the lender is going to accept for a credit, but they may not accept a $40,000 credit that the buyer is entitled to contractually. So that's why we want to separate out the credit for closing costs, for example, and or the funds that we want the seller to pay the buyer's agent for the buyer's agent's commission.
It's confusing, right? Because commission is closing costs as well.
It is. They are all closing costs, but it seems as if, John, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Fannie Mae guidelines do not consider the commissions paid to the buyer's agent as part of the credit that they may disallow. And then what if I ask for $50,000 plus, I'll just leave the 3% in there. I asked for a $50,000 credit. Had one recently, which there is a point of contention. And the lender only allows the borrower to use $40,000. Well, under section 5 of the contract, it indicates that the buyer is going to lose that additional $10,000. So what you must do if you're being aggressive and you're asking for a substantial closing cost credit from the seller, you need to specify that any unused credit will be used as a direct reduction in the purchase price. I may have asked for 50,000, the seller agreed to that. But if I don't specify in the contract that any unused credit will be applied as a direct reduction in the purchase price, I may lose that $10,000 in my example. Any questions about that? And then section 3G3, this is obviously very important to all of us. This is how we're paid. I'm going to say that the buyer is asking the seller to pay the buyer's agent's commissions 3%. So you need a representation agreement at least equal to 3% or more. Now, no longer are you required to submit that representation agreement or the last page to the listing agent or the seller. However, escrow very well may ask for that to confirm the amount of money that the buyer's agent is entitled to. So remember, you must have a buyer representation agreement in your possession, signed before you even show property. And recently, we were apprised of the fact that now CRMLS is going to be implementing a registration process for buyer representation agreements. It's going to be similar to listing contracts, as a matter of fact, and somehow they're going to track it by the buyer's cell phone number. So that means when you take a buyer representation agreement, and they're still trying to figure out how they're going to do this, but it's going to be happening, you're going to have to register your buyer representation agreements with the MLS. Isn't that nice? Just like if you have a listing contract and the property is not listed for sale currently because the MLSA indicated the start marketing date is sometime in the future, you need to register that listing contract with a multiple listing service. Otherwise, it's a $1,500 fine.
So if the representation agreement says 2%, but you're asking for 3%, what happens then?
The seller has no obligation to pay anything more than what's on the representation agreement. And from the buyer's perspective, or from the agent's perspective representing the buyer, they're only entitled to whatever that buyer representation agreement specifies. So it's a good question. If I ask for more as the buyer's agent than what my buyer representation agreement specifies, I cannot collect anything more than what's on my buyer representation broker compensation agreement. And then section, any questions about that before we move on?
Well, on that, not everybody would know. A lot of times the seller might not even know that.
Escrow's gonna
Because they
know.
No, but escrow is going to request that.
Okay.
That's where there's going to be validation of what the buyer's agent is entitled to. And then I would say, even going to that extent, if a buyer thought that their agent was getting more than what the contract read, they're probably sue them.
Can
Okay.
a listing agent ask to see it?
You have no obligation to give it to them anymore. At one time, there was an obligation to give them a certain aspect of the signature page, as a matter of fact, but not anymore. The contract doesn't read that way. But that's a good question. Okay. I'm not sure why that changed, but it did change. And then H1, verification of all cash. Well, the default is that I have attached proof that I have sufficient funds for the closing costs and down payment. Or in this case, I'm sorry, verification of all cash purchase price. So we said $1 million. I need to provide proof of our funds that I have at least $1 million. So if you check the box, then within 3 days after acceptance, would you be obligated to pay or to provide that documentation? So it's the default is I'm attaching that documentation to my offer. H2, verification of down payment and closing costs. Oh, that's if we're getting a loan. Once again, I have attached to my offer proof that I have sufficient money to cover the $200,000 plus any anticipated closing costs. Verification of loan application, it's attached to the offer. It's ideal to have a pre-approval. Pre-approval seems to be, and not seems to be, it is much more reliable because it suggests that the lender has obtained tax returns, pay stubs, things of that nature, whereas a pre-qualification It's just based upon my representation that I am earning $2 million a year with no evidence thereof. And then it's possible to have a fully underwritten pre-approval, but I don't know, we don't see that too terribly often, as a matter of fact. And then final verification of conditions, section J. 5 days prior to the close of escrow, that can be modified, and it's just to confirm that the property is in the condition as of the date of acceptance. In addition to that, any repairs that are agreed upon are completed. That's the whole idea of the final verification of condition. So we want you to fill out the verification of property condition form to verify that that's taking place. So if the property is delivered in a condition other than what was witnessed at the time of acceptance, then the seller has an obligation to correct those deficiencies.
Rich, there seems to be a misconception that the seller is not supposed to sign that.
Well, we certainly, I don't know why the seller would object, but there's no reason to not ask the seller to sign it. It's making them aware. Let's Carlos said many times people are refusing to sign it. Well, if they refuse to sign it, let's just get an email from the agent or from the seller that indicates we refuse to sign. It doesn't change anything.
There's still items remaining.
Oh, yeah, yes, especially, right? Because it does pin a responsibility on the seller. So the question always becomes, what if the seller didn't do these things? Well, if it's a $20,000 repair, it's probably a valid reason for a buyer to not go forward. If it's a $100 repair, it's probably not a valid reason for the buyer to not close escrow. So the materiality becomes a real question.
I think the form itself though says that that's not a condition or
It is not a condition of closing, correct?
unless it's something substantial.
Yes, if it's a material item, then it's, I would say, a valid reason for a buyer to not proceed with closing escrow. So we said that. Then section K, assignment requests. Everybody know what the assignment request is? It's very common now. So perhaps I submitted the offer. Actually, Jesse submitted the offer as Jesse Waters. Now Jesse wants to assign that to him and his wife. That's an assignment request. Jesse wants to assign his interest in a purchase contract to his family trust or to his LLC. That's an assignment request. So if there's an assignment request in which it's just Jesse assigning it to his wholly owned LLC or wholly owned revocable family trust, then the seller cannot refuse and no documentation is required. However, if Jesse is assigning his interest to an LLC in which there are members other than him, then the seller is entitled to get information as to those individuals, and if they're getting a loan, they need to provide evidence that they are qualified for the loan, or they need to provide evidence that they have the sufficient money for the down payment, or if they're paying all cash. Once again, they have to provide evidence thereof. Assignment requests are very common.
Is it addendum or is there a specific form?
There is an assignment of agreement addendum that you would actually have them sign, and escrow should be requesting that form as a matter of fact, and it's going to cover those different aspects that we just talked about. As if it's an assignment in which the proportional interest from the assignor, meaning the original buyer, to the assignee is different, then the assignee has to initial the front page of every single disclosure and every preceding document. But if it's just Jesse assigning it to his wholly owned LLC, then the assignment of agreement addendum does not require that the assignee, namely his LLC, initial the first page of every underlying document or every preceding document. And then the loan, let's see contingencies, and this is very important. Obviously, the loan contingency, the default is 17 days. We can say no loan contingency, even though we're getting a loan for $800,000. And if I were to say all cash, it is not necessary that you check the box, but if you check the box, it's not going to hurt anything. The appraisal speaks for itself. If the appraised value doesn't come in at $1 million or more, the buyer can actually cancel the transaction, or you can renegotiate the purchase price. And the appraisal is simply an opinion of value. It's not considered an investigative report. The only reason you would ever give the seller and or listing agent the appraisal is if you're canceling because the appraised value came in lower. There's never any reason for you to give that appraisal to the seller and or listing agent. As a matter of fact, it gives them information that's not advantageous to you in regards to negotiations. Because just think, if the appraised value came in at $2 million on $1 million purchase price, and I want some repairs, why is the seller ever going to do anything for me? Because they know that I'm going to proceed no matter what, because I've got $1 million in equity in this purchase. So the default, once again, for the appraisal is 17 days. And then the appraisal, once again, so let's assume appraisals, they specify square footage in a property. Now, if in the event the square footage is less than what was anticipated, or maybe less than what was published on the MLS, can I cancel based upon the appraisal contingency? The answer is no. Exactly. That would be a cancellation based upon the investigation contingency. So the appraisal contingency is simply just an opinion of value, nothing more than that. So if the square footage on the appraisal differs substantially from what the buyer believed they're buying, you can't cancel based upon the appraisal contingency. And the contract is specific in regards to that.
But you can use the findings from the square footage from the appraisal to cancel because of the inspection.
I mean, based upon the investigation contingency,
Yeah.
you can say, right, because if they said on the MLS, the square footage is 3,000, but the appraisal came in at 2,000 square feet, that would be your basis, but you would be canceling on based upon the investigation contingency.
But based on this report, on the appraisal report.
Yeah, why not? Right, you've got evidence that the square footage is not what the seller indicated the square footage would be.
The only time you will provide the appraisal report is, excuse me, if you're canceling because the appraisal came in lower. That's the only time you would give the listing agent the appraisal report. But what if it does come in lower? You don't want to cancel it, you want to renegotiate.
Well, I guess it would be optional, but there's no contractual obligation for you to give them the appraisal, as a matter of fact. So you can do that, but you have no obligation to give it to them. So, yeah, they may ask for that. It's probably a valid reason to give it to them if you're trying to renegotiate the price, because they may not believe it. Yeah, all right. I think that's a very good point. It's a very good point, because if you don't reduce the price, I want you to reduce the price, I want to cancel. So here we are. Here's the appraisal. Investigation of property, that is a broad spectrum in regards to what you're entitled to. So the physical inspection is very common. Neighborhood noise, who knows? There's a number of things. You've got 17 days. That's the default time frame. Obviously, you can change these periods. And then informational access to the property. It's just you being entitled to have the right to access the property. It is not a contingency of the transaction. And then insurance, L4, not only is obtaining insurance a contingency, but the cost of insurance is a contingency. So if you were to cancel based upon the fact that the insurance premium is $20,000, you would cancel based upon the insurance contingency, not based upon the investigation contingency. So two things: insurability, can you get it? And then what is the cost? And maybe it's prohibitive for you, and that's why you want to cancel. And then this is very important. Now we see some differentiation here. Review of seller documents. The default is 17 days after acceptance or 5 days after delivery, which is later. So what if I were to say that I changed, because I want to be aggressive with my offer, I changed the review of seller documents contingency to 5 days. But the seller did not deliver all the disclosures until day 6 or day 5. Actually, that 5 days becomes irrelevant, because I'm entitled to 5 days following the date of delivery of the seller disclosures. And there's a myriad of seller disclosures: TDS, SPQ, FHDS, if it's built before 1978, lead-based paint, for example. So you can see sometimes, I don't think people recognize how it can defeat what you're attempting to do. So if the listing agent isn't providing you those documents, or the seller isn't providing those documents in a timely manner, the contingency period actually is far greater than what the contract is going to indicate. The preliminary title reports, so once again, 5 days after delivery, it's going to be the greater of 17 days in the default time frame or 5 days after delivery. And then keep in mind for the preliminary title report, sometimes there are amendments to the preliminary title report. So the contract stipulates that I have 5 more days to review the preliminary title report if there's been an amendment to the existing prelim. So they gave me the prelim, something on there that's wrong or something that was removed. They now amend it and they send that to me. I have 5 more days in regards to viewing the prelim, right? I've got an expert over here. Common interest disclosures, once again. So the 5 days is relevant throughout. If it's not delivered within the time frame specified in the contingency period, I have 5 days after delivery to remove that contingency. In the seller documents, it's very extensive. If they don't deliver all the seller documents, you have no obligation to remove that contingency. And they can't force you and they can't cancel. So that's the other aspect. Sorry. And then review of leased or lien items, solar panels. That's very common as a matter of fact. In regards to any leased or lien items, contract steps specifies the seller has no obligation to contribute monetarily to buying down the lease, so on and so forth, with solar panels, whatever the case may be, any lease or lien items. As a matter of fact, you accept it or you cancel the contract as a buyer. And then sale of buyer's property. Sale of buyer's property is not a contingency. I have it checked here, but if I am making a contingent upon the sale of my existing property or a property, I need to check this box and submit Form COP. Time of possession, it's upon notice of recordation. So the same day, you can specify a different time frame. Section M2, seller occupied or vacant units, close of escrow. So with that said, let's assume the seller wants to remain on the property for a certain time thereafter. If the time frame is 29 days or less, we would use Form SIP, seller in possession. If it's for 30 days or more, we would use RLAS, which is residential lease after sale. And the RLAS mirrors that of the traditional residential lease or month-to-month agreement. And then M3, tenant occupied property addendum. So let's assume you really don't know that the property is tenant occupied. I mean, you're just led to believe that it was vacant or the seller's occupying it. The contract stipulates that if it is tenant occupied, thereafter it requires that the Form TOPA is completed afterwards. And why is that important? Because we want them to move out. As a matter of fact, what we want, if I'm a buyer and my intent is to occupy that property, I want them out. I don't want to be the one responsible for evicting them. So that's a critical aspect in regards to the contract. Seller delivery of documents. If we look under section 14A, it's a myriad of documents. They have 7 days to deliver everything. Sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions. What is that? There's not a lot of meaning to it, but once the escrow instructions are sent out, each party has 5 days to sign and return the documents. So there are times buyers believe that they're protecting themselves by not signing the escrow instructions, but they're not giving up anything by signing the escrow instructions, as a matter of fact. But what can you do if they don't sign and return the escrow instructions? You can send them a notice per form, and 2 days thereafter, you can cancel the contract. I don't think any of us want to do that. And then section N3, time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents. The seller has 3 days after acceptance to order the common interest disclosures. Escrow typically accommodates them, and they will contact the seller for their credit card. And then install smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, water heating, bracing. 7 days after acceptance. Why is this important? Because the body of the contract indicates that if these items are not in compliance when an appraiser comes out to appraise a property, let's assume someone's getting a loan. If those items are not in compliance, and the appraiser has to return to the property. The cost of the return or for the appraiser to come back out is going to be at the buyer's expense. Excuse me, the seller's expense. Thank you. Yeah. And then, and 5, evidence of representative authority. So we've submitted a contract, it's accepted. Let's assume the seller is an LLC. They have 3 days thereafter to provide evidence that they have the authority to sell the property. Likewise for a buyer, if it's an LLC or a family trust, they have 3 days thereafter to provide evidence that they have authority to act on behalf of that entity. So if it's an operating agreement, they have to provide the operating agreements, or an LLC, they have to provide the operating agreement. If it's a revocable trust, for example, they can do 2 things. They can provide the trust documentations, or they can provide a trust certification. Either one would be acceptable. Any questions about that? Okay, we'll move along quickly. And then items included and excluded. Most of the items, so the way the contract reads, if there is cabinetry, for example, built to specifically house appliances, the appliance within that cabinetry is theoretically a fixture. But if it's just a refrigerator that's sitting there, it's not a fixture. So that's something that may not be included in the purchase price. So if you want things included, like the refrigerator, or if you're unsure, check the box or write it in. And likewise for P2, excluded items, if you want a piece of junk that's bolted to the wall because of concerns regarding earthquake safety, put it in here that you want it removed. And then under allocation of cost, Q1, natural hazard zone disclosure. It is common that the seller pay for the report. Check the box for environmental. And then you can choose whoever you want, as a matter of fact. And then Q2, optional wildfire disclosure report. Personally, I wouldn't check anything there. This is just the default language that the RPA shows, as a matter of fact. Q3, if you want a termite report or pest control report, and they're one and the same, type that in here and then specify that the seller's paying for it. And this is only for the cost of the report, not the remediation, if there are any deficiencies noted in that report. And then it's a 50-50 chance, but let's assume there's a buyer, the buyer's getting a loan, and you wrote the purchase contract, and obviously you're looking out for the buyer's interest, and you said, Mr. Seller, we want you to provide a pest control report. And if it's in the contract, it is likely, at least a 50% of the chance of the time, the lender is going to ask for the report of work completed or not completed. So they're going to want to see that any termite issues have been remediated or corrected. And if for some reason you're concerned about that and you don't want to have the buyer, or the seller complete the termite remediation, issue an addendum deleting the report. And if you delete the report, the lender's not going to ask to see the work completed. Likewise, people will sometimes in the purchase contract write in that the buyer's paying for the inspection report. Don't ever do that, because anything you put in that contract, it makes it subject to lender examination. So we don't want the lender to look at the physical report, right? Because they may make a determination that there are deficiencies in the property that we want corrected before we're going to close the transaction. So don't do that. And then smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, water heater bracing. It's common that the seller pay for it, and I check that box. Section Q5, government required point of sale inspections or reports, and that's simply what it is. You can say seller, you can say buyer. Now, there aren't very many point of sale inspections or reports in Orange County, LA County. A 9A report is typically required, so you're gonna have to have somebody come out to the property, review it for certain things in regards to compliance with water conservation and safety issues. So in Orange County, there are no point of sale requirements, as a matter of fact. For example, water conservation, that would be an issue. If you check it, then the seller has to comply. Likewise, section Q6, this is not the report, but this is actually the corrective measure. So let's assume a home was built before January 1st of 1994. It is not going to meet water conservation and plumbing fixture flow rates. And if you check the box for seller and seller in Q5 and Q6, it's going to require the seller to replace all the toilets, faucets, things of that nature. And they may not want to do that. So do you want the property or do you not want the property, right? You can just leave it blank. Or you can say seller, or you can say buyer. Q7 escrow fee. Well, of course, we want to use sterling escrow because that's how we make money here. And then no matter what, I always suggest each to pay their own fees. Let's assume you negotiate a discount for your client. If you say both or each to pay 50-50, then you're going to give up half of your savings to the other party. So each to pay their own fees. That would be my recommended approach, as a matter of fact. Owner's title insurance policy. It is common the seller pay for that. And we certainly prefer lawyer's title. Mary was here, as a matter of fact. And then buyer's lender title policy. Let's see, if the buyer's getting a loan, the contract defaults to the buyer paying for the premium associated with the lender's title insurance policy.
So Rich, there's 2 title insurance policies on it?
It's the same policy, but just different aspects in regards to the coverage. The lender's policy covers the lender. So the lender wants to be insured against any defects in title or any unrecorded encumbrances that may be senior to their loan that they're going to record against the property. Now, we've had 2 different examples recently in which there was fraud and there were encumbrances that were never relinquished and now are taking a seniority position over the lender's position. And there's substantial amounts of money. So it's a real problem. In one particular case for our buyer, the buyer can't refinance or sell that property right now. Because the lender, the title insurer is suddenly not going to write a check for $600,000. They're now going to litigate the whole case. That they were not aware that this other encumbered existed at the time they closed the policy. So if anybody ever asks you whether they should have title insurance or not, your answer should be yes. It's going to protect your buyer. You know, it's those odd cases that can occur. Most likely they don't, but there are claims that exist.
In those instances, did they not obtain the title policy?
They did. They
Was it
did.
in there, or-
And here it is, 8 months later, one particular case, right, where it's being litigated and they're trying to pursue the individual the seller, who was fraudulent in regards to not disclosing these encumbrances that were out there. How that didn't show up, I still don't understand it, but yeah, it's awful. And of course, they're looking at us possibly as if it's our fault, but that's another issue. So yeah, title insurance, it can very well be worth it. And remember, with title insurance, you buy a property, you buy it as a husband and wife, or you buy it as an entity in LLC, you transfer that property to an assignee or somebody in any way, your own entity in which there's another partner, title insurance is no longer effective. So if I buy it as Richard Moore and I transfer it to an entity in which I own the same pro rata interest, 100% of it, then title insurance will continue. But if I transfer it to myself and my wife, or an entity owned by myself and my wife, suddenly now title insurance is no longer going to be effective. So I want you to be aware of that. So any changes in the pro rata interest in the property will now delete title insurance.
So, Richard, so the assignment request, there's a 17-day time period to submit that. If somebody submits it, say on day 15, it would be advisable then for the listing agent to in a counter indicate that the title report, reflect the new assignee for sure. Because what if they had already ordered, the title report?
It's not going to matter because it's going to be ultimately it's going to be the buyer that's affected by that. So the seller won't be affected by that. Exactly. So the title policy in your example, it's going to reflect the insured is going to be the assignee, not me as an individual, but whatever entity I assigned it to. Private transfer fees, it is default. The default is that the seller pay for that. Ladera Ranch is the only area in which there is a transfer fee, and I think it's 0.25% of the selling price. And then Q16 and Q17, if there's anything else you want to negotiate. Q18, home warranty. I just put $1,500 in there. And you can choose who's going to pay for that. If for some reason the buyer's waiving the home warranty, be sure you check the box. Then other terms, what will we use this for? Because on our example earlier, we said if we want a $50,000 closing cost credit, this is an area in which we could say any unused credit will be used to reduce the purchase price dollar for dollar. Or let's assume I'm buying a property. I need to specify that I am licensed by the California Department of Real Estate. So this is an area in which you can use that information to properly disclose that.
Or if you're related to the seller, to the buyer.
Yeah, correct. Yes, good point. If you're related to any of the parties.
And if you ask the seller to pay for the press report and you want the seller, that is where I would typically indicate the seller to complete any section 1 findings and provide, either.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with doing that. You can do that in the initial offer. You just want to be sure that you also specify that there's going to be a completion issued. So usually what we see is that proper language is found in the request for repairs as to not just completing the work, but then also issuing a completion. So if you don't specify that, the seller might do the work, but they're not going to be obligated contractually to issue a completion. So it's probably easier to use a request for repairs, or if you're comfortable copying the language from the request for repairs in regards to the seller also providing a completion, that's acceptable, a completion, right? Yeah, years ago, it used to be far different. It was always a part of the purchase contract, but now sometimes there are those transactions in which the termite remediation is substantial. I think the largest we've come across is $27,000 or $28,000. It's a lot. Of course, then the seller's shocked. Probably shocked if they have to pay for anything, right? Yeah. I know we got all these other documents we can attach, but I just want to go through a few of these different things as a matter of fact. Talk about section 5.2, retention of deposit. If it's a purchase contract and it's a primary residence, in regards to liquidated damages, the buyer's limitation or exposure is limited to the amount of the deposit not to exceed 3% of the purchase price. In regards to liquidated damages, if it's an investment property, there is no limitation in regards to liquidated damages. It's going to be whatever the earnest money deposit is. And section B, all cash offer, right? That's pretty self-explanatory. But cash is considered a form of financing, so keep that in mind. Don't leave. A lot of these things I'm going to skip over because we've talked about it as a matter of fact, but section 6C, buyer stated financing. So the seller is relying on the buyer's representation. In our case, we said $1 million purchase price, $200,000 down, $800,000 loan. What if the buyer said, I'm going to pay all cash? But they don't, and then they pursue a loan. Can the seller cancel the contract? No, you can't. But if they can't pay all cash, they're still obligated to close as agreed. Does that make sense? So I said, I'm going to buy the house for all cash, but I've lied to you. I've lied to the seller, and my intent was to get a loan. Can the seller now cancel based upon the fact that they now became aware the buyer's attempting to obtain financing? No. However, if the buyer doesn't close as agreed, then there could be repercussions for the buyer.
That used to be common practice, huh? Just to get the
It
offer
was
accepted.
very common. You know, people are making all cash offers. And if you think about it, if there's an entity that's making an offer, you don't know how many offers they're making out there. You probably have $1 million or $2 million that's showing on their bank statement. But maybe they're making offers worth $10 million. You really know that that's going to be valid. And then condition of property on closing, unless otherwise agreed, the property is to be delivered in its as is, to be delivered as is. The condition as of the date of acceptance. So that's what the seller's obligation is. If you want to talk about a warranty or guarantee, this is one of the few aspects of the contract, right? So what if the stove was working at the time they viewed the property and it's not working at the time of close of escrow? Well, the seller has an obligation to repair that. I'm gonna skip down here. The contingencies, section 8. If the buyer is getting a loan and the appraisal does not come in our example, at $1 million, but the buyer still qualifies for an $800,000 loan, the buyer cannot, so let's assume the buyer waived the appraisal contingency and the buyer still qualifies for the $800,000 loan, the buyer cannot cancel based upon the loan contingency. And if assuming they already waived the appraisal contingency, it puts them in an awkward position. We talked about the appraisal and the fact that if the square footage does not match the square footage the buyer believes they're obtaining, can't cancel based upon the appraisal contingency. Let's see. So common interest disclosures, that's a contingency. Buyer review of lease or lien items. Solar panels, for example, they may not want to proceed based upon the obligation they have to assume. Then removal or waiver of contingencies, section I. You don't have to remove the contingencies unless all those reports and disclosures have been provided you, as a matter of fact. And let's see. And then section 9A, note to buyer, items listed as included or excluded in the multiple listing service. If it's shown as being included on the MLS, unless it's included in the purchase contract, it's not enforceable. So be sure that anything that you read on the MLS and you believe is included is referenced in the purchase contract. And then items included in sale, fixtures, so on and so forth, curtains, curtain rods, all of those items are included, as a matter of fact. So you shouldn't be concerned about that, but if you are, you should specify that. We've had many instances in which people take their curtains and their curtain rods. I don't know why they'd ever take that crap, but they do.
I had one where the seller was gonna take the chandelier.
Yeah, they've taken the chandeliers, right?
It was like a $25,000
And
chandelier.
then they put a little piece of crappy light in there. So it's, you know, that's an issue. So hopefully when you're doing your final verification of property condition that the chandelier is still there, but who knows? And then let's assume you have TVs that are mounted to the wall. Well, the obligation is the TVs go with you as a buyer, excuse me, as a seller. You can remove the brackets. The seller has an obligation to remove the brackets and patch the holes. And then pictures, things like that, you know, the little nail holes. Well, the seller does not have any obligation contractually to repair those little holes or paint.
The old contract had a box, so you could check.
Yeah, all these details are always changing in the contract, and you can bet by the end of the year, we're going to have more changes, as a matter of fact. It always happens. And then section 11, statutory and other disclosures. Everybody should be familiar with the transfer disclosure statement. That is, there are very few exemptions to that. So when the TDS is delivered, the buyer has a right of rescission based upon delivery on that. Now, the law is not explicit whether or not there's anything or any deficiencies noted on it. So you better have a reason upon delivery. But delivery of the TDS is very important because it does give the buyer an opportunity to terminate or rescind the contract, even in the event they remove their contingencies. So let's assume I submitted an offer, all my contingencies were removed, and then thereafter the seller delivered the TDS and seller property questionnaire to me, the buyer now has a rescission period of 5 days to rescind the contract. And then in addition to that, if the TDS is delivered and it's in page 3 or all the pages are not signed or the boxes are not responded to, the buyer has an opportunity to rescind the contract. So if you're a listing agent, you need to be very careful about delivery of that. And also in page 3 of the TDS, not only does it require the seller's signature, but it requires your signature. So one of two things on page 3 of the TDS, and the agent representing the seller can indicate the results of their inspection, or if they check the box for an agent visual inspection disclosure, they have to attach that. And when a TDS is required contractually, then the seller property questionnaire is required. If a TDS is not required, then the exempt seller disclosure is required.
So does the time frame change if you the seller delivers the TDS along with, like, I guess before the offer is accepted and at acceptance? Like
If the TDS is delivered, if all the disclosures are delivered before the offer is submitted, then the buyer, that can actually now be a non-contingent offer. And when the buyer submits an offer saying non-contingent, assuming all the disclosures were delivered beforehand, then that would be a non-contingent offer. However, if they're not delivered up front, it opens up the rescission period for a buyer. So all of these aspects fall under the same auspice as the TDS: lead disclosures, home fire hardening disclosure and advisory, defensible space disclosure. So those aspects have the same weight and power as the transfer disclosure statement. Let's see, there's a couple things I want to talk about. So a question came up yesterday in regards to contingencies or removal of contingencies. So if a buyer is at day 17, let's assume all the default timeframes exist, and the buyer has not removed their contingencies, and now day 18 occurs, day 19 occurs, what happens? Well, the contingencies just live on. And the only way the seller can force the buyer to remove the contingencies is to deliver a notice of perform. So keep that in mind. And then now let's assume we have all the default timeframes for contingencies are 17 days, but we change that. Everything but the loan is now 10 days, but the loan is 17 days. So we get to day 8, we can deliver a notice to perform to the buyer to remove all the contingencies. Now, what if we say all? Even though the loan contingency didn't have to be delivered until or removed until day 17, well, the contract actually specifies that if I deliver that and it's only applicable to certain contingencies, then my notice of perform will not be considered defective, even though I didn't specify or exclude the loan contingency. What if I deliver my notice of perform 3 days in advance? Well, right now the contract says you can't deliver a notice of perform no sooner than 2 days in advance. If you do that, then your notice of perform could be defective, and you may have to re-deliver that notice of perform.
And that kind of counters what you just said, right?
It does, but there are certain aspects of the contract that talks about that specifically, as a matter of fact. So highlighted that.
Calendar days prior to. like,
Yes, calendar days, correct. But once again, if you deliver the notice of perform on Friday, count the days, Saturday, Sunday. If the execution of the event falls in a weekend or legal holiday, it then falls to the following business day. So they would have 3 days. They'd have till 11:59 p.m. on Monday evening to remove those contingencies specified in the notice of perform.
So the performance cannot land on a weekend or holiday.
Correct. Bless you.
Bless you.
You have a question up there.
Do I?
Yeah. It's you have to click on it. You can't do it from the top.
See it. Is a notice to perform defective if a TDS is not complete? I guess it depends what the notice to perform is for. If the notice to perform is to remove the contingency for delivery of the seller disclosures, and the seller was required to deliver a TDS, the buyer's in no precarious position, because if the seller disclosures are not delivered, the TDS is no longer, it's not effective, or the notice of performance is not effective. So defective, maybe that's a term. It's rendered meaningless in your example, Michael.
Unless he removes contingencies for everything except for that. Right?
No, is the contingency removal is very broad. So all seller disclosures, that falls under one contingency, as a matter of fact. So just because I delivered 10 out of 11 seller disclosures does not require the buyer to remove separately contingencies for those separate disclosures. Almost done.
I think just a thumbs up on it.
So this is what I wanted to specify. Maybe this will help further explain the point I was trying to get across. Under section E, and I'm about halfway down. If a notice to buyer to perform or notice to seller to perform is incorrectly delivered or specifies a time less than the agreed time, the notice shall be deemed invalid and void. However, if the notice is for multiple items and the notice shall be valid for all contingencies and contractual actions for which the delivery of the notice is within the time permitted in the agreement, and void as to the others. So if everything but the loan contingency is 10 days, but the loan contingency is 17 days, I delivered the notice of perform on day 8. For all contingencies, it will apply to everything excluding the loan contingency. I don't know why they word it this way, but that's just the way it is, unfortunately. And then let's see, I just want to go over a couple of definitions as a matter of fact.
And just because it says all, the buyer is under no obligation to remove all contingencies, but those that.
Correct. Right. If they do it, then that's at their own peril, as a matter of fact. So definitions: acceptance means the time the offer or final counter offer is fully executed in writing by the recipient party and is delivered to the offering party. So we have it signed, the buyer submits an offer, the seller signs it, the seller returns it on Monday. On Monday is the date of acceptance, unless the buyer were to withdraw their offer. Agreement, it means the purchase contract and all addenda as is condition. It doesn't prevent you or doesn't give the seller any less of an obligation to not disclose any known deficiencies in the property. Counting days, and this is very important. So if the day of acceptance is today is day 0. Tomorrow would be day 1 when counting the contingency period or the close of escrow. Likewise, if we're going to send a notice of perform, if today is day 17, let's count back 2 days. So today's Tuesday, so on Sunday, I could actually deliver a notice of perform. I could do that. And liquidated damages, we talked about that briefly. Unless all parties to the contract initial the liquidated damages clause, you need to issue a counteroffer and include it or exclude it. Otherwise, the contract is not considered complete. Same thing with arbitration of disputes. All parties must initial, or if they haven't initialed these paragraphs, then you must issue a counteroffer to include or exclude arbitration. And then entity buyers, or offer, will put the name of the buyer, and then acceptance, and then entity sellers. If we have a seller that's an entity, we're going to check the box. We're going to name the entity here. And then below, we would have the actual individuals who have the authority to act on behalf of an entity signing. And one form I want to go over before we wrap it up, and this is new. Federal reporting requirement purchase addendum. So now this is a separate addendum that's been incorporated into the RPA packet. It's likely to be included in the purchase contract in December of this year. Now, to prevent money laundering, if the buyer is an entity or if the buyer is paying all cash. Now, the reporting person is going to be escrow. They're going to be required to get the identification information of the underlying members in LLC. So if it's an LLC, for example, that makes an offer on a property and they're paying all cash, they're going to have to get the name of the individuals, their social security number, and also be reporting that to the government. Most likely title is going to be involved in that. If it's someone who's getting a federally insured loan, they're not going to have to comply with that because the lender already is reporting that to the IRS. But a further way of preventing people from laundering money by purchasing real estate. So buyers are probably going to be annoyed at the fact that now I'm going to have to give up all this information on myself individually when I'm buying this through an LLC and the LLC is paying cash. So that is a big change, as a matter of fact. Any questions? Nope. I am done for the day. Well, thank you for coming, everybody. Appreciate that.
Is there one more question up there?
Was there a question? There could be, or is it just me? Nope. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, bye.
Bye, everybody.
You want to have a drawing?
Yeah.